Before we move on to the last three tips, let's summarize by making an observation. Tips one and two are really before you've actually gotten into the content of your material, right? You have, with number one, you have this very, very brief idea what it's about, and then you basically admit to your prior beliefs about it, your preconceived ideas. Number two, you find out who's responsible, and then you go do a little Google / Wikipedia investigation to find out if there are any controversies or whether it seems like this is somebody you can trust. 3 and 4, you're starting to read in a little bit more depth, right? So is it informative, persuasive? Are they selling something? Is there research contained within? Okay? It's with 5, 6, and 7 where you really start to dive into the material in a little bit more depth. And this is where you're really going to be able to find some attempts to hide assumptions, to oversimplify, to bias things, and so on. Okay? So number 5. Beware of oversimplification. This is important because I'm not saying simplification is bad. In fact, simplification is good, and in a sense, it's even necessary. What we're doing in this class is simplifying. We're taking material that was produced by university researchers for an audience of university researchers, and we're kind of boiling that down to a level that's understandable to people who are new to the subject, right? So to a certain extent, all of our educational experiences are a version of simplification. The problem is when you take simplification too far, oversimplify, you sometimes end up distorting what the original message was. So here's the problem though. How do you know if the original message has been distorted if you're new to the subject? Right? You have to know both the complex version and the simplified version to know if oversimplification is happening. So we're stuck basically looking for clues. Right? There are particular types of techniques that people tend to use when they are oversimplifying. One of them is called overgeneralization. Right? This basically is when you will take some piece of information that's true of a small group and then assume that it's true of a much larger group, and you're not supposed to be able to do that. This is actually something that we've already seen, and it's really one of the fundamental mistakes that I want to get students to stop making by the end of the semester, and that is when you generalize from your own individual experience. Right? Each person is a case study, and just because something's true for you doesn't mean it's true for anybody else. Right? Making that mistake is an overgeneralization. Let's think about that a little bit more, this idea of overgeneralization. And to do that, we're going to tie it to this differences between men and women, men are from Mars, women are from Venus idea, and also to what may have been the single hardest quiz question you have seen this semester so far. Right? So remember this one? Women have more empathy than men. Which statement is most likely to be true? Some of you took 4 attempts to get this right, because the correct answer is the one that seems the least likely. It's that last one. Many men have more empathy than the average woman. You think, how could that possibly be true? It seems to contradict what's in the question. That's the answer. Right? And the reason that we have such a hard time accepting that, believing that, is because when things like gender differences, differences between men and women, are presented to us. They are presented in that overgeneralized, oversimplified format. It's sort of like this. So remember the idea of frequency distributions back from the beginning of the semester. Imagine these are two frequency distributions of empathy for men and for women. Okay? So as you move to the right on the scale, you have more and more and more empathy. And then, of course, the height of the curve, that's how many men there are and how many women there are. And the oversimplified version is all the men are on the left, all the women are on the right, no overlap between them. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. It's never like this in real life. Here's where it works for real. All right, so if we got our gender difference in empathy, we've got our basic bell-shaped curve for men. All right, seen this many times before. Most men are kind of bunched near the middle at the average score, and then as you get to the extreme highs and the extreme lows, you have fewer and fewer and fewer, and then of course that vertical line in the middle there, that's the average score. And here's what it is for women. I just basically took the same curve and moved it over a little bit. All right, so women are bunched near their average, and then as you get to extreme highs and extreme lows, you have fewer and fewer, and then of course, as I said, the vertical lines are the averages. Okay? When we say that there's a gender difference in empathy, such that women have more empathy than men, we're talking about the difference between those two vertical lines only. Right? We are talking about a difference in average scores for women and average scores for men. Is it real? Yeah, it's real. But that tells you nothing about differences between individual men and individual women. Right? And you can see that by all the areas that those two curves overlap. Right? So for any particular score, it could be a man or it could be a woman because those curves overlap so much. Another way to think about it, the gender difference is just that tiny difference between vertical lines in the middle. The human difference is the difference from the lowest score to the highest score. That's a vast, gigantic difference. Only a tiny bit of that is explained by gender. That portion of the curve right there, that's the portion of men, or the number of men who are more or have more empathy than the average woman. That's a pretty substantial number, right? So lots of men have more empathy than the average women, even in this case where there is a gender difference, as there is, right? Second, false dichotomy. False dichotomy in some ways will feel a little bit like overgeneralization. It's another situation where it's acting like everybody this way and everybody that way. Here, though, we're talking about falsely claiming that there are only two possibilities. Okay? False dichotomy is actually something that has been in the news a little bit over the last couple of years. They don't use the word dichotomy, they actually say false choice. So you're creating a false choice. Okay? I'm going to give you a couple, maybe actually three different examples of false dichotomies. Okay? One, probably the most famous one, is the idea of nature versus nurture. Right? So if you find out that there's some genetic component to something like intelligence, for example, as if that implies that there's no environmental component. Or if we find out that there's an environmental component, it implies that there's no genetic component. No, the answer is somewhere in the middle. Okay? Why are you forcing me to choose one versus the other? The answer is somewhere in the middle, and that is very, very, very commonly, maybe even almost always or always the case. A false choice, false dichotomy, is actually something that people will sometimes use when they argue. Okay? So I'm going to give you two examples of an argument using false choice. One is actually an argument that I once had with my mom. Okay, and I'm picking this specific one because I want you to realize I have tremendous respect for my mother. Okay? She was the first person in her family not just to go to college, but she ended up getting a master's degree. By the way, she returned to college when we were kids, right? So I would not be here today if not for my mother's trailblazing. Right? Very intelligent woman. Over the years, I happened to like arguing with her. Right? So we're arguing one day a few years ago about the death penalty. In case you haven't figured it out, because I haven't told you, I'm pretty liberal. Yeah, I do not support the death penalty and never have. Yeah. Now, your opinion about the death penalty, whether you disagree or agree with me, it's not really relevant. Just listen to the argument that my mother tried to make, though. She said, Ken, so just imagine that there's somebody who has committed a horrible, horrible murder. No question he's guilty. No chance of rehabilitation. She said, you would not want this person to be executed. And I said, no, I would not want this person to be executed. She said, oh, so you want him to go free? No, I didn't say that. Aren't there options in the middle? It's not you execute somebody or you set them free. Right? That's a false choice. That's a false dichotomy. And remember what I told you a few minutes ago. My mother is very intelligent. Right? You can kind of slip into doing these things without even realizing it. Right? Let me tell you another example of false dichotomy or false choice. And this is from somebody whom I do not believe, about whom I do not believe they're very intelligent. My good friend Tommy from Fox News. Can't the left let families grieve for even 24 hours? Say, this isn't about a gun. It's about another lunatic. By the way, if you will note, this was on February 14th, 2018. This was the day of the Parkland shootings in Florida. It's either gun or lunatic. It couldn't be both. Couldn't be something in the middle. Couldn't be neither. That is a false choice. Now, you might disagree with me with respect to gun control. I told you a minute ago, I'm very liberal. Okay? I'm in favor of very, very strong gun control. You might disagree with me. That's fine. If you disagree with me, do not argue like this. Because if you do, you'll lose. So really what I'm doing is I'm telling you how to beat me in an argument. Don't argue like Tommy. Right? You'll lose. Okay. That's false dichotomy or false choice. Overgeneralization, extremely famous term. False dichotomy, extremely famous term. False choice, also becoming famous in more popular context. So I've literally seen it on the news before. Okay? The headline effect is actually something that I made up. So you're not going to come across that anymore, or anywhere else rather. But it is something to keep track of, to be careful about. Both in the way people kind of present information to you, and then also in the way we kind of share that information with other people. Realize, just for a few minutes, the process of creating science journalism. Okay? You'll have an original research article published in a scientific journal, as I said a few minutes ago, created by a university professor for an audience of university professors. Science journalist comes along, finds some article that he or she thinks might be interesting, so they write a medium length article in the New York Times, say. Okay? And then what happens next is somebody else, usually an editor, will condense that into a 4-line headline. Okay? From a journal article to a newspaper article to 4 words. Okay? Something's got to go missing in the 4 words. And sometimes the things that go missing are key. Okay? So we can't go around just sharing headlines that we've seen without maybe digging a little bit to find out, is this oversimplifying? So how about soy makes men aggressive? Here it is. Soy makes men aggressive. 4 words. Came across this a few years ago. Got curious. So I read the articles on Yahoo News or something. Said, hey, don't eat soy burgers. Research shows that it makes men aggressive. Didn't sit right with me. So I found the original article published in a journal called Hormones and Behavior. What the researchers did is they took monkeys, little teeny tiny monkeys, and they fed those monkeys soy isoflavones. By the way, that's not soy. That's heavily processed part of soy. Okay. They gave them so many soy isoflavones that had these tiny monkeys been 150-pound men, it would have been the equivalent of eating 100 soy burgers per day. At the end of stuffing these poor monkeys full of an inhuman amount of soy isoflavones, these monkeys got aggressive. Does that mean that soy makes men aggressive? Doesn't even mean soy makes monkeys aggressive. If you stuff a monkey full of a ridiculous amount of food, they might throw it back at you. Now, this article said nothing like what that headline implied, and it's actually pretty common that happens. All right, so be careful when people are sharing 4-line summaries. There could be some oversimplifying going on. Okay, number 6, misrepresentations of science. Now, realize if in tip 4, the site, the website, the article failed that tip, that there was no research, this is an easy one. There aren't going to be any misrepresentations if there is no science. But assuming that there is maybe a little description of some research, you want to think about these 3 types of ways that people commonly will misrepresent the way science actually works. Okay? First, think about controversies. Right? The idea is that science is really built on controversy. Right? The whole idea of replication. You get one person, one researcher does a study, somebody else has to come along and replicate it. Maybe those 2 disagree with each other. That's a scientific controversy. Okay? And that controversy needs to be settled with more research. There are 2 different ways that people will distort with controversies. One way I think it's by accident. One way I'm pretty sure it's on purpose. Okay? Controversies by accident. On the news, picture somebody saying, hey, new study came out today, and it found the complete opposite of what we believed from previous research. And all of a sudden, it's as if the rest of that previous research didn't exist, and we now just believe this new study. That's not the way it works. That new study gets thrown onto the pile. right? It is the accumulation of knowledge, the accumulation of research over time that allows you to make a conclusion. If one new study contradicts everything else, it gets considered, right? You may have to temper your conclusions previously, but you're not going to throw out 25, 35, 50 years worth of research because one new study found the opposite. I think, when you hear about that on the news, they generally don't know. They just really think that this new study, it must be better, right, than the old studies, and so it will cause us to throw out everything else. That's not correct. So again, I think that's done accidentally. This other one, I'm pretty sure it's done on purpose. Right? What people will sometimes do is create a controversy when none really exists. Okay? And honestly, if you're paying attention to what's happening right now with respect to the coronavirus and social distancing and things, there are all these occasional articles published by people who have the opposite opinion from the prevailing view. Okay? Just because there's one person who thinks that we should be opening up the economy right now from a scientific standpoint, that does not mean that this is a legitimate controversy. We got to look at what the whole body of researchers right now believe. Okay? Another kind of also large example is, think about something like climate change. Okay? What percentage of people who actually conduct research on climate agree with these two statements? Planet Earth is getting warmer. Human behavior is primarily responsible for that. The answer, about 98%. Okay? So just because you can produce one researcher who claims the opposite, that doesn't mean it's a scientific controversy. Right? The idea is that, people like to say there are two sides to every story. Yeah, there are two sides to every story, but that doesn't mean the two sides are equal. Right? If it's 98-2, that's not a real scientific controversy right now. That's pretty much settled. Right? It's a political controversy. Right? So both from the should we be opening up the economy right now and from the, is climate change real? That's a political controversy, but it's currently not really very scientifically controversial. Okay? I think generally when people are doing that, they're doing it on purpose. Second misrepresentation, spurious correlation. This is actually an easy one to talk about because we've actually covered this earlier in the semester. It's the idea of drawing a conclusion that two things are causally related simply when they are correlated. Okay? Correlation does not imply causation. Making that mistake is called spurious correlation. Okay? I'll give you a sort of a kind of a fun or funny example, and then a quite realistic one. Back several years ago, an organization, I forget who it was, they just collected some random data, and then they measured some correlations, and they found some that were statistically significant, and then they just kind of made fun of them, kind of pretending that they were causally related, right? And everybody knew that they weren't. So, for example, Nicolas Cage movies cause people to drown themselves. And because, for whatever reason, there happens to be a correlation between the number of Nicolas Cage movies produced in a given year and the number of people who drown themselves in swimming pools. Nobody would pretend that those are causally related, but they are correlated. In real life, though, people do make that mistake. How about the idea that vaccines cause autism? Right. By the way, in case you don't know, this original thinking about vaccines causing autism, it's based on one fraudulent piece of research that has never been replicated and has since been retracted. And the person responsible for it was lost his medical license. Okay, so not a shred of scientific evidence, but why has it remained? Well, partially because of this spurious correlation idea. See, because what happens is kids get their vaccinations at around 18 months. Autism tends to be diagnosed right around that same time. So parents get their kids diagnosed with autism and they think back and they realize, oh my gosh, they just had their vaccines 3 weeks ago. There you go. Two things correlated. They must be causally related. Okay? Autism, it turns out, has a number of spurious correlations, largely because we still don't know why it happens. The one that I've seen most recently is that freeway exhaust causes autism. What do we have? Well, we have a correlation. Kids who grow up closer to freeways are more likely to develop autism. That doesn't mean that freeway exhaust causes autism. It might. We need more research to determine that. But right now, all we have is a correlation, and we cannot assume that those things are causally related. Doing so, again, is making that mistake of drawing a spurious correlation. To detect it, to see that other people are doing it, you want to look for words like associated, association, correlation, and then after they use those words, if they act like the things are causally related, they're making that mistake. Okay? Last of the misrepresentations of science, sampling errors. This one is also can be pretty easy because we did talk about this one earlier in this semester as well. Remember way back in the research designs module, we talked about representative samples, random sampling, versus self-selected sampling is kind of the main one that you want to avoid, where participants select themselves into their sample. So when you see the results of some kind of survey, you want to find out how the sampling was done. You want them to be representative. One way you can look for a clue, if they did it right, they probably want you to know that they did it right. So they'll tell you it was a representative sample. If they didn't tell you that, you have to worry. Right? I'm not just guaranteeing that it's wrong, but be concerned. If you ever see the phrase non-scientific sample, then ignore it. That means it was self-selected. Okay. Last, persuasion tricks. This is the easiest one for me to talk about now because I'm not going to talk about it now. I'm going to tell you there is a terrific NOBA module on persuasion. Read it before you start this Evaluate Psychological Claims project. Look for examples from that module in what you're reading right now, or whatever you find for your website. Okay. Give you a couple of target areas. There's the triad of trustworthiness, the triad of trust. Look for that. Look for examples of that. I already gave you, when we were talking about what's the purpose with tip number 3. All right, what's the purpose? Sometimes people will try and disguise persuasion as information, and then I think those are really good ones to focus on. Okay. Obviously, if you find more, you're welcome to use those. But so let me stop here and let me summarize. You're gonna find a website or an article related to anything psychological. Go ahead and Google it. Chocolate can cure depression, for example. Okay. If you don't want to look for anything yourself, on the handout for the assignment that you'll see on the assignment link on Blackboard, there are some suggested sites that you could use. Okay, you're going to read that. You're going to apply the 7 tips. Okay, tip number 1: what do I already believe about chocolate and depression? I heard that once. It seems like it makes sense. So there's my preconceived notion. Right, who's the person responsible for this? Oh, it's an MD. They have a degree from Harvard University, and there is nothing that I've discovered, controversial about them from their background. They're not selling anything. We're on tip 3 now. They're not selling anything. So it's almost like a little bit of a checklist here. Tip number 1, they passed. Tip number 2, they passed. Tip number 3, they passed. Okay. You go through all 7 tips, and then at the end of that, you come to your tentative conclusion. Based on how they fared on these 7 tips, this looks like a pretty reliable website, a pretty reliable source, or it looks a little bit shady. Okay? And then that's what you're going to be handing in. Right? Just a brief description of the website, the 7 tips, and your conclusion. Okay? Do actually take a look at this as soon as you can, so that if you have any questions, you'd like any clarification, I'll be able to provide that for you. And if not, should work out well. So thanks again for listening.